a couple of things. I just want to introduce our team, first of all. Jason Neff, our technical writer. Eddie Salinas, our senior software engineer. Alex Bowman, Disney's senior software engineer. Product owner. Alex Bowman. Chet Berger, principal architect, and Megan Hanna, project manager for Cloud Pilot. Interrupt us for anything at all. And one thing I want to say, and this isn't a disclaimer, but this is just a fact. This is a pilot. FireCloud is part of a pilot. It's part of an ambitious plan by NCI, this whole concept of how we make TCGA data available for everybody. So they have this ambitious plan that has sort of 4 parts, 3 different cloud pilots, of which we're one, and the GDC, the Genomic Data Commons, which will be the authoritative source for TCGA data, and in the future also Target and all sorts of other public data. So all of that is coming online. There are 2 other cloud pilots, one out of Institute of Systems Biology in Washington, and the other one, Seven Bridges Genomics, which is right down the street. We've all sort of come up with rather different solutions to the problem of what, to the stated problem. All of them host TCGA data and make it available. So I just want to say, feel free to go try out the other systems. They're different. I think that our place, the place where we're strongest is tools and running at scale. That said, this is still a very young system. In fact, it's sort of like a toddler, and every once in a while it has a tantrum and seizes up, like yesterday. So there may be some glitches today. It's just the truth. So there may be some hiccups, and we'll try to keep you apprised as we hit them. Okay, and Jason and Eddie, will you help these guys get in? All right, I'm going to start off. We've got an agenda. Everyone should have workshop materials. You should also have these. These were all emailed to you last night, too. We have sort of an aggressive agenda, and some of these exercises we haven't done before. Basically, we want to cover a bunch of things. We want to walk you through basic functionality in the UI. Then we want to walk you through how to actually install tools, write the WDL, upload them to FireCloud, and kick off a run. So all of that, hopefully by the time you're done, you'll be able to walk through the whole process end to end. We've got 6 different hands-on exercises. The first one will simply just run through kicking off an analysis using the UI. Then we'll move into writing in WDL, creating JSON templates and running WDL in Cromwell. And then some sort of more advanced pieces like setting runtime parameters in the method config. All of this you can follow along with your instructions, so you might want to have those up. Okay, so I'm just going to sort of walk through. So what is FireCloud? FireCloud is 2nd generation Firehose, and I know just from people in here, there's a lot of Firehose users, some expert Firehose users here. And FireCloud is the next generation. Essentially, Firehose got scaled. It basically tips over now because it can't scale any farther. The centerpiece of FireCloud and Firehose is the workspace. To a workspace, you can bring your data, your tools, your workflows. Provenance is captured for every run. That is, what version of what method, on what data at what time. In addition, there's a method repository that stores the tools. So when you open up FireCloud, what you're going to see is a large number of workspaces. These workspaces have all been pre-populated with data, in this case, TCGA data. There's 2 different varieties, controlled access and open access data. How many people in here have worked with controlled access TCGA data? Okay, quite a number of you. Okay, so you'll be able to access all of TCGA data in here. Basically, all of the data is set up by subtype, in workspaces by subtype. both the open and the controlled access. Controlled access workspaces contain both open and control, so that's seg files, expression files, BAM files, clinical files, the whole array. And one thing about this data is it's well curated, so you won't find replicates. You'll find the best of each piece of data. In many cases, there are replicates for various different reasons. So this is the basic structure. There are data-only workspaces broken down by subtype. In addition to that, we've been in the middle of all our efforts in the last month or so have been in building best practice pipelines, okay? And we'll walk through what we have now that's live. And we're right in the middle of trying to roll 3 or 4 more out this week. In addition to that, we have tutorial or workshop workspaces, and those will all be made available. All these materials and all the materials from all our previous workshops are all available on our website. We have really good user documentation. We have a forum. Bring all your questions to the forum. That really helps us. This team here is the team that answers the forum posts. And we can point you to the documentation, and all these materials will also be up there. Did I say interrupt if you have questions? Okay. Right now, what we're trying to get out is our CGA best practice mutation calling pipeline end to end. It's broken into 4 different components. The QC workflow and the Mutect workflow, those 2 are out there and available now. We also have a mini mutation calling workflow, which is just useful for all sorts of things. We use it in testing a lot. That just has contest, Mutect 1, and Oncotator. There's also a cluster analysis workflow. I think it's consensus clustering. Available next week. We've really been struggling to get these other 2 out. These are the other 2 modules of the complete end-to-end mutation calling pipeline, somatic mutation calling pipeline. And that's the filtering workflow, which has all those tools in it, and the copy number workflow, which is using the GATK, CNV, and ACNV. We have a number of other things that are under construction. Gistic is about to roll out. We'll get that out in a few weeks. The GTEx pipeline is also very close. That'll run star aligner and EQTL. There's a number of other things. You can see Mutect Philogic, our merge data files algorithm that are all sort of in process and underway. So check in. We'll try to notify people every time we roll out a new tool. And if there are tools you particularly need or want, let us know. Also, if you're trying to put your own tools in and you run into snags, just come find us.
And the way to find us is probably best to initially
start
with the forum.
Start with the forum.
That
That's the best place.
Other members of the community can benefit from the help.
Yep.
Could you remind us how we find the forum?
Go to FireCloud.org.
FireCloud.org opens you up to our landing page, and there's the forum, the user guide, and the entryway into FireCloud. Okay, so just to really, we put these slides in. They don't really belong here because everybody wants to know these. So I'm going to try and run through them really quickly. It's a whole new model when we move to the cloud, and it's very different in an academic setting. So we're all having to learn how we actually do this. So basically, every workspace is linked to a FireCloud billing project that tracks all the storage. Oops, sorry, I'm missing a slide. Here we go. Every workspace is linked to a Google bucket. Storage costs from that bucket are attached to go to a project. Every project is linked to a billing account. So every workspace generates costs 2 ways, compute or storage. All of those are attached to a project, which is attached to a billing account. In addition, every project can have multiple workspaces. So a PI can organize to have lab members have a workspace. PI can have a workspace. All of these can be private. You set your own, you set your permissions. Permissions have 3 different tiers. so you can set your permissions. And in addition, if you are a PI or a production manager or project manager, you can fund each of those projects by a different cost object or a different grant or some different funding mechanism. So that's how it works. In order to either clone or create a workspace or run anything, you have to have access to a project, okay? So there's two ways you can get access to a project. So there's two ways you can get access to a project. One is to use a bucket that's already there, for example, TCGA. TCGA data is in a bucket. If you want to compute on all of TCGA data, you'll clone that workspace. It will create a shallow link to the TCGA bucket, right? We pay that project, so you won't pay for the storage of TCGA data, right?
Okay, but if you go
You're
ahead.
going to need to speak up.
Okay, if you go ahead and suppose you want to do some kind of meta-analysis in the TCGA workspace, you're going to go ahead and clone that workspace, say the BroadE workspace. When you clone a workspace, that's creating a new workspace. You still have to have a Google project associated with it, because any analysis that you run within that project is going to be output files that are going to be written to the bucket that is associated with your clone. And its cost is going to be charged to the project that's linked to that cloned workspace. But when you clone a workspace like TCGA, you aren't copying all of these, all of the BroadE data into your new workspace. What you have in your data model, and we'll be getting into this further detail later on, is within your data model, you have links to the files in the bucket that was associated with the original TCGA workspace where all the data resides. So bottom line, when you clone a workspace, you don't pay for the storage of the data that was in the workspace that you clone, but you will be paying for any new data that you add to that workspace, and you will be paying for any analysis that you run within that.
Right.
That's why you have to have a project.
Right.
And there's one other.
So if you clone the TCGA workspace into your workspace and run compute and storage, you will be charged for that, but you won't be charged for this storage because this is spending this. Now, if we were to go ahead and delete this, you'd be without the data would go away. So you have to be careful. So this, you can also, the other way in which you can access a project is if someone shares a project with you, right? So you can go in, and depending on how they share it with you, if they give you writer or owner, you can work in that workspace. Again, you're not in control of it. So if the owner decides to delete it, your work will go away, or anything you've cloned from there. So just.
Can I jump in one?
Yep.
How many of you are familiar with Google Cloud Platform separate from FireCloud? Okay, so you know that there's a concept of a Google project. These FireCloud billing projects are Google projects, but you don't own the projects. The FireCloud service owns them. So when you want to go ahead and have a project to use within FireCloud, you have to contact. I believe it's through the help email. You have to go.
It's all
and
up
make a
here.
request. It's a request to do that.
And these are actually live links. So if any of you need to set up accounts, you'll know.
Yeah. So
This will take you there.
the point I wanted to make is that when you use a project within FireCloud, you can't bring in your own project. You have to request FireCloud to create a new project for you with your billing account.
One last thing. It's a whole new ball game. It's free to upload, it's cheap to store, and it costs a lot to download. So conceptually, you have to think differently about how you run your projects. But just remember those three things. Free to upload, they want you to get your data there. Yes?
Is it difficult to assess what these costs are? Are they changing all the time? Is there a central place we can see?
Storage is simple. It's very straightforward, $26 per terabyte month for the best storage. Compute is different, and it's going to depend on the amount of compute, the amount of RAM you need at your starting. One way we try to help people to think about it is if you understand the number of compute hours your project takes on something comparable, you can sort of pull together a guesstimate of what it's going to cost. We try to collect run times on things, so if you notice in our materials, we give run times. From those run times, you can sort of extrapolate.
And you're charged on, like if your processes are waiting, do they accrue cost or is it?
While they're queued up, no, I don't think so.
Well, waiting.
This is just.
If the process is running, it's waiting on something.
If it's actually doing some sort of compute, so it's on a virtual machine that's running a process you want it to run, you're paying for any time that that machine is up.
Yeah.
So it's not really CPU time. So
Yes,
it's,
and the costs do vary, but Google provides that information.
Okay.
Yeah. And, you know, as eventually, when we've got enough experience, we will have a little widget that is able to sort of make predictions before you kick off a run, on our tools at least.
And is there a little meter you can see you spent this much to?
No, but there's a story written for that.
Yeah, that's
We
what
all
it is,
need that.
Okay.
Yeah, we all need that tool.
Yeah.
We found out the hard way, in fact, that we need that.
Throughout this workshop, you're going to hear us continually say there's a story for that. What we mean by that is we maintain a backlog. We're using agile software development methodologies, and Alex maintains a backlog of user stories. And those are the new features that we plan on adding to the system over time. Yes?
So I'd like to ask a high-level question, which is, let's take an example. So there's some TCGA, let's say RNA-seq data up there, and I decide I want to analyze it in a way that never has been. So I make a pipeline, I don't know, maybe I have to add some tools to it, and it runs.
Right.
Now, what I typically do is I'm going to visualize it many different ways and chop it up, do you know, differential gene expression, kind of not computationally expensive stuff, not using the private TCGA reads anymore. Would you recommend one does that on FireCloud? You sit in R and you work with your FireCloud, you know, intermediate data.
I would say if you're going to be doing sort of interactive exploratory analysis of your data, and in the case of, say, RNA expression data, if you're going to be looking at the expression data itself, it's not a tremendous amount of data, I would imagine. So for currently, what I would recommend doing is going ahead and downloading the data file and then working with it interactively. Yeah. In your own R Studio. Eventually, we do plan to add more functionality into FireCloud so one can explore data interactively, maybe by integrating a IPython or Jupyter Notebook interface into it. But that's well off in the future right now.
Yeah.
The one thing that you do need to be aware of is that when you download data, you're going to be incurring egress costs, and they're very expensive.
But for RNA,
For normalized expression data, it shouldn't be an issue. But
if it cost a penny to download a file, I'd be surprised.
But if you are downloading, say, a BAM file, it will be very expensive.
Well,
Because, I mean, let's say you want to view your BAM files in.
well, okay. So here's.
We actually plan on adding IGV.
IGV will be added soon. I think it's actually in the next sprint.
Yeah.
But to answer your question, because it's a really good one, in our group, our team was trying to figure out how to do a pan-cancer analysis on all of TCGA 11,000 patient samples, the absolute results, which have a manual review step. So what they did was they actually built a little interactive piece that talks directly to the FireCloud APIs. And it's actually an interactive interface. They spun up their own VM outside of FireCloud, but built it on the API so it talks to FireCloud and writes the results back to the FireCloud data model for the results. So these kind of interactive tools to do your final analysis step will absolutely be built, you know, at some point.
Yeah. And in the case for the example that Megan described, the interactive tool that they developed runs within the Google Cloud. So they're pulling data from the buckets in the cloud into their interactive application.
Right.
And so there are no egress
download
charges there.
costs. So you don't have to download. It gets around that downloading piece. So they just spin up a VM, transfer the data. When you transfer laterally, there's no extra charge. Then they do the manual review, write the results back into the FireCloud data model, and they're done. And then they fold down the VM.
So can you run like R on this VM and
Yeah.
visualize and so forth?
Yeah, that's exactly what they did. It opens up a visualization for absolute and copy number. Yes?
Are the APIs public? So
Are they? Say that again?
are the APIs public?
Yes.
Great.
Yeah, I think they're available through.
Yes, they are.
I think
And we
it's
have a link.
API, is it API?
API.FireCloud.org. They're publicly accessible APIs. You can script
And-
against them.
We have the link in the material somewhere. Okay, so I didn't want to spend long on that, but I know everybody everybody asks these questions. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about the data model. I just want to sort of run through this quickly. So the data model is a framework that captures and formalizes entity relationships. The method configuration then binds the data model to the workflow inputs and outputs, and we'll show you all this later. And each method configuration is targeted to a particular entity type, the root entity type. So everything starts with a participant or a patient. Every patient has some sort of sample. In cancer, it's a tumor. Because we work with tumor and normal a lot, there can be many samples associated to a patient. Tumors and normals then form a pair. And if you are computing over an entire cohort, you want to be able to use a pair set. Sometimes you want to use a participant set or a sample set to compute on. So currently, FireCloud uses the TCGA data model, which is this one I just showed you. But there are lots of other data models out there. And what we've built is we've built a system that is extensible to other data models. So eventually, we'll build in other data models, or perhaps you'll be able to bring your own. And that will cover for things like trios or germline analysis or time series, things like that. This data model is actually really flexible. So I've seen all sorts of different data models sort of hacked onto this one. So, it's quite a flexible data model. Now I want to just talk briefly about how we get data and metadata into FireCloud. And this is something that it's been a fair amount of confusion of. So let's just start with some definitions. Metadata contains entity attributes that are associated with a particular data model entity. For example, age and gender are associated with the participant entity type, and tumor type is associated with the sample entity type. So this is just, I'm sure all of you are used to these kind of metadata files. And any number of additional attributes can be added. Data is any data type that a user wants to use in FireCloud. It can be copy number, gene expression, methylation, DNA sequencing, clinical data. It can be anything, RNA-seq. So data is loaded into the Google bucket that's associated with your workspace, and we'll show you that. Every time a workspace is created, a Google bucket is automatically created. You can actually link to the Google bucket directly from FireCloud Workspace, or you can use GSUtils, which is a command line Google utility. And the metadata is then imported into FireCloud, where it populates our data model, and we'll actually demonstrate that. Once your data is loaded into the Google bucket, you need to edit your metadata files to specifically state the Google bucket address, right? So you've loaded your data into here. Every Google bucket has an address. You're going to actually append that onto your metadata TSV. And then you're going to upload that into FireCloud. So it's a little bit fussy. Hopefully at some point, though not in the near future, we'll have an easier interface for doing this. You import your metadata file as TSVs into FireCloud to populate the data model. Each entity type in the data model, for example, participant, sample, or pair, requires its own TSV, and these have to be uploaded in a specific order. Participant has to be first because you have to have a participant to hang all the samples and then pairs have to hang on samples and participants. So that's a. It would be the same. They all have to have a participant ID. Every sample has a sample ID.
Okay, the sample ID might be the same.
That's fine. It can be the same. Yeah.
The sample IDs have to be unique. So if you have two
Well,
participants.
sample IDs have to be unique.
Yeah, so if you have two participants, and with each of those two participants, there's one or more samples, all of those sample IDs have to be unique.
I'm just thinking the data type I'm thinking is multiplex, and so multiple samples are combined and then analyzed, and then there's another.
Each sample would have to have
another element of the data that is obviously the reporter I mass that corresponds to the sample.
Right. So each one would have to have a unique name, which it would anyways.
Okay,
And then they would all be associated with the patient ID.
There's a question here.
If you clone a workspace, then the TSVs will automatically be pointed to the right data address, or what would it be?
May I, can I answer that?
Yes.
As we said, that when you clone a workspace, you're doing a shallow copy. So when you clone a workspace, there's a set of samples in that workspace, and there are attributes associated with each of those samples that points to a file in a bucket. When you clone that workspace, you're going to be copying all of the entities in the data model, but you're not going to be changing the references. So the files that are referenced in that cloned workspace are pointing to the bucket address of the data from the workspace that you cloned.
And so if you take a bucket and you take it off
Yes.
egress, or if you copy it, actually copy it,
That, right.
the TSVs are magically modified?
No, they won't be. You'll
Yeah,
be left
they won't be.
with dangling references. So right now, when you clone workspaces or copy entities, the data references don't change. We're doing a shallow copy. We hope eventually we will go ahead and support deep copies as well, but we do not right now.
Okay. Here we are in the workspace, and just before we go in, and I'll show you what the data model looks like, I just wanted to point out a couple of things to you. See, these are all the different workspaces. Everywhere we have a little bar. I have access to controlled access data. These are restricted workspaces. These are controlled access workspaces. And we've actually built in functionality to protect that, since files that you generate from controlled access data may result in controlled access data. These will be controlled access workspaces. So you'll see warnings will pop up. But now let's go look and see what the data model looks like in action. I'm just going to filter on ACC, open access data. So here we are in the workspace on the summary tab. I'm just going to walk through the data tab. So here we are. Here's the participant information, and you can see age, cohort, gender. This is participant-specific information. Here's the sample tab. In this case, we have, again, name, participant, entity name, participant, sample type, etc. Everything in blue are links to data. We can actually see what that data is right here. So all of these files, this is all the open access data, so seg files, expression files, have been written to the data model here. So you could click on any of these links and actually download this data, or you can simply work with it here. In order to work with this workspace, you'd actually just clone it. But this is the way we use the data model. So the data model holds all of the metadata about the samples and any other attributes we want to add to it. In addition, it's also populated by all of the data files that are related to that either sample or participant. Does that make sense? Okay. So, yes. Ah, yes. Yes. better? Yeah, and one other thing, when you, this red bar is because I need to relink my ERA Commons ID for my controlled access data, which you're forced to do every 24 hours or so, just for security purposes. Okay, so let's see, let's go back. Okay, we're going to walk through a little mini mutation calling exercise. You guys are welcome to jump in and walk in with, along with me. Remember how we said we had some problems? We may run into them now. Alex will, yeah, I know. But just follow along, best you can. And so what we're going to do is we're going to kick off a mini mutation workflow. It's going to run on tiny BAMs. These are 100-gene BAMs that we just filtered down so we can test things more readily. There's also a pair of whole exome BAMs. These are things where we know the runtime, 20 to 30 minutes for the tiny BAMs, and 3 hours for the whole exome BAMs. Okay, so I'm just going to, and just stop me with questions, anyone, because we're just going to. Okay, so I'm actually going to filter to the, I happen to know the name of this workspace. I'm going to put in tooldev, and here we see our tooldev workshop mini mutation calling. If you guys want to find that. We're going to enter the workspace. So here's the summary tab. I'm just going to sort of walk you through this. Right here is your Google bucket link that I was talking about. We can actually click that. It'll take you directly to the Google console. And here's your Google bucket. If you wanted to add more data right there, you could upload right into that bucket. In addition, I'm workspace owner here. You can see the date it was created and 0 submissions have been made. Nothing's running this. Over here, if you look at this, this is a locked workspace. That means this can't be touched except by me, the owner. So the way we're going to start is we're going to clone this. And all of you can clone this too. So I'm going to hit the clone button.
Before you clone, could you just click on sharing? I want to show people
Well,
that.
I was going to do it in the cloned one.
Okay, all right.
So in order to clone, I have to specify a Google project. You should all have BroadE FireCloud workshops there. Specify, actually, that's the only one you probably have. Also, this has to have a unique name. So probably put your username on the end of this or give it some completely different name. I'm going to call this test 2 because I think I ran test 1 this morning. Test 2. And if you knew this was going to contain protected data, you could click this, but I know it's not going to. So I'm going to click OK. OK, now you see I'm in my new workspace. OK, so again, it's got a brand new Google bucket. Now, if I want to share this, I can add anyone new. There's 3 different kinds of access: reader, writer, and owner. Owner can do anything. If you give someone reader access, it means that they can clone the workspace, but they have to clone it into their project. So in other words, they can use your workspace, but they cannot incur additional charges to you. Yes?
Did they download the data?
I'm,
If they download the data.
Yes, they can.
in
So that-
reader, yes, they can.
Yes, they can. So that's actually
Yeah.
an interesting issue. Suppose that there's a workspace that is made public, and any of the TCGA workspaces that are open access, they're publicly readable by all of you. You can go ahead and actually download those files, and the cost, the egress charges for downloading those files are going to be charged to us, which isn't great.
That's for TCGA data, yeah.
That's for
Don't
TCGA
download.
data. Don't download. So the answer to your question is yes, if you're granted read access to a workspace, you will be able to download the files in that workspace.
Okay, so that's the, and you can read more about these different levels, but this is how you can control and share and work with collaborators. So again, workspace attributes. These are files, generally reference files. Yes? It's if you want to take someone off.
Okay, so if someone is there, that's how you remove them.
Exactly. Yep. There are workspace attributes, which are reference files that you need in the workspace. We'll go into a little more detail on that. There you can lock, clone, or edit any of this. And notice no submissions have been run. All right, let's go look at the data we have in here. Now here we're actually going to look, oh, right, we're going to import data. I forgot, that's the exercise. Okay, so there's no data in this workspace. So step one,
What's in the workspace?
the method config, right. And we already uploaded the BAMs to a bucket that's associated with this.
Would there be a reason why I have two instances of my data when I cloned it?
To what?
I have data yet.
Oh. You're probably in a different workspace. Check the name, but that's okay. Is it, doesn't have tooldev in there?
I'll check. Question here.
What are the restrictions on who one might allow to share the data? They have to have accounts with FireCloud, for
They
example?
have to be registered in FireCloud.
And if it's restricted data, they have to have,
If it's restricted data, even if you share a workspace with restricted data, they will only be allowed to use it if they have permission to use restricted access.
but you can share it.
You can share it, but they won't be, it'll be grayed out. And what happens is every day dbGaP, we pull down a whitelist from dbGaP with everyone who's approved to use TCGA controlled access data. And it checks against that before it will allow them into the workspace. Okay. So I'm going to import from file, choose file. Here, these are all, everyone, you have these in the material you downloaded. You have to load participant first. It does this nice thing. It gives you a little preview. I can see there's my 2 cell lines, whole exome 100 gene. I'm going to upload that. I'm going to choose my next file, which is the sample file. Again, we can preview. I can see there are my BAM indexes. And note, we already formatted these for you. This contains the GS, the Google bucket address of these particular BAMs, okay, which we already put in this bucket for you. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for those of us that were on the wait list, we didn't get this email. Is that like, did somebody send it?
Jason?
I'll resend it to you right now.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry, so you said do participant file first?
Participant file first, yeah. Then sample. So they're loaded. And lastly, I'm going to choose the pair file. Load that. And again, here you can see entity pair ID. And here we have our control sample ID and our case sample ID. That's our normal and our tumor. Okay, and again, the participant sample ID.
Can I just step in?
Yep.
Could you bring up the sample data model again? I mean, the samples?
I'm sorry?
Bring up the samples, and let's look at any of the data files. Just click on any of those, click on any BAM. We aren't going to download it. But what I wanted to do was to point out that the bucket that this file is in FireCloud-TCGA open access. This is not the bucket that's associated with your cloned workspace. It is, we actually have all the TCGA data residing on a separate bucket that's not associated with any workspace. But data models within FireCloud can still go ahead and reference those buckets. But it'll be up to you to go ahead and handle the authorizations for accessing that bucket. And you might want to do this in a project where you go ahead and obtain a bucket resource within the Google Cloud. You put all your data up there, and then you can go ahead and create your data model within the workspace and reference those files in that foreign bucket. Okay?
Does that make sense?
Does that make sense to people?
Okay, so now our data model's populated. Okay, we've got 2 participants, 4 samples, 2 pairs. Here we are in the participant tab, and you can see this is the file we just uploaded. Yes?
When
when you clone the workspace, it creates an empty bucket for you.
Correct.
You can just upload your data directly to that bucket?
Correct.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
Correct.
you can do that, or if you already have data residing in the cloud, you can go ahead and
Pull it in.
reference that bucket.
Yep.
The important piece of using the bucket that's associated with the workspace is that the access controls that you attach to the workspace also are reflected on the access controls to the bucket that's associated with the workspace.
So that's essentially what we just did here. If you notice, our metadata file had our Google bucket address from our open access. You would put your Google bucket address wherever you'd put that data.
But you have to have a separate Google account, or would it be the same account?
No, that's all associated with the project. You have a project. Once you have a project, you can create a workspace. Then that automatically creates a bucket. All right, so now you can see that our data model's populated. There's our participants. Here's our samples. And notice these are our BAM files that are in that bucket. If you notice, those were written into the Google bucket address was added into to give this address and participant. And then lastly, we have our 2 pairs. All right, let's go to our method configuration tab. And here's our single method. This is our mini mutation calling configuration. And I'll open this up. Sorry, let me make this a little smaller. All right, so the method configuration is where we tie everything together, where you essentially you tie your method to your data model, okay? And we'll just walk through. Chet will look at this and we'll go over this in more detail later. But you can see that these are the inputs to these methods. And you can see in this case, this case sample.bam. If you recall, case sample is one of the attributes on the data model. Okay, so this is how we link all this. And again, there you have control sample.bam. This method configuration can be edited, and it will need to be edited frequently, or at least when you set up a new method to run. I won't edit that now. And then our last tab is the monitor tab. We haven't kicked off a run in here yet because this is a new workspace, but we will now. So we're going to go into the mini mutation calling, and we're actually going to launch an analysis. Oh, wait, I wanted to point out one more thing. Sorry. This is the name of the method configuration, and the root entity type is pair. So this configuration needs a pair to run on, okay? So we're going to launch an analysis, and notice participant pair, here's all our data. We know this runs on a pair, so I'm going to select the 100 gene pair and launch that. And that analysis is kicked off. I'll show you one other thing. You can also launch multiple pairs. We can enter here this dot pair.
No, you don't have a pair set.
Oh, you're right, sorry. Never mind, I don't have a pair set. But you can create a pair set and then launch all of them all at once with one click. Yes?
So maybe this is related to what you were just saying about how you could do multiples at once, but it seems like there's a lot of going around and clicking and so forth.
There is, and I assume that all of you, yes, and you will do.
So how do I?
All of that will come later.
Okay.
I think most of this room is, but we just want to just run you through the basics, really for the conceptual piece, for the data model piece, yeah.
Does this do job avoidance, so somebody else is running the exact same thing?
No, and Chet will talk about ways to sort of hack job avoidance while you're testing tools.
There is a story for job avoidance.
There is a story
Alex
for
can
job
talk
avoidance.
about it at some point if you'd like. We do plan to go ahead and add that to our system.
When I click on job run, I got a message. I'm not really have access to the Google bucket associated with this.
I'm going to ask. Well,
Yeah, this is the problem. It's a Google problem, unfortunately, that happens to be today and yesterday. And days before that, we haven't had this problem, so we're still waiting on Google to resolve it. create a new workspace, it creates the bucket for you that you can upload data, and you actually can't access it at the moment. It's taking several hours for that access to get effective.
Okay. So I just want to show you one other thing. In the Monitor tab, we now have a running, oops, it failed for this very reason Alex was just talking about. But let me actually go into a workspace that previously ran this, because you can actually drill down. So here's a mini mutation calling that was previously run. And if we look at the Monitor tab, you can actually drill way down. So I just want to walk you through that. There you've got a timestamp. Here you've got your 4 tasks, and Chet will talk about tasks later on. You can see the status of each of these. For each of these, you'll have standard error logs, and you'll have a JUS log. It'll summarize all your inputs and all your outputs. When all these runs are completed, all of the results are then written back to the data model. So we know that this run was run on a pair, and now you can see all these results written here. These are actually the results of this run. One thing we try to do is create nozzle reports so that all the results just get dumped into a nozzle report. If we look at the whole exome pair and we open the nozzle report, this is for our 3 mini mutations, so this is just contest, mutect1, and oncatator. We can see all of the results are summarized here. Here's the mutect results. The oncatator is actually a huge file, so we just create a link to HTML for the VCF here. And then a lot of information about the methods and outputs. So hopefully on most of our pipelines, we'll create this.
That you attach to the whistle and such like that when you're making your own tools, or is that something different?
Each of these reports is a separate task. Right, to the end of your FireCloud.
Oh, so it's on something you also
You
strip
call
this out.
something, you would go ahead and on. And if you're familiar with the FireGraph, GDAC, it goes ahead and generates some reports for each of the analyses that it runs.
Where's a good place to learn more about that?
It's built on top of R. I can go ahead and after the workshop, I'll try to link to that or point you to people who can answer that for you.
So that should be okay.
Can you configure a retry? Like your access fails when you tell it to retry
Code workspace.
Right now, I don't think we can do that. Well, actually, we actually do in one case, and that is you can go ahead and use something called preemptible virtual machines within Google, because those are third-party. Excuse me?
That's if it fails on, like.
Yeah, that's if it fails, if you're preempted, but if the task fails, you can't automatically retry.
Okay, so what we're going to first talk about is you already saw examples of workspace attributes. We described that there were attributes associated with each entity in our data model. And you can also go ahead and define attributes associated with the workspace itself. And the reason why you would do that is view these as almost global variables that could apply to analysis that you run on any of the entities within your workspace. Those of you who are Firehose users are familiar with this concept. If we take a look at the mini mutation, see if I can find it. Mutation calling. During the course of this workshop, you're occasionally going to be working in FireCloud, and you're going to see that you're going to have to re-authenticate. That's because you're using Google authentication tokens, which have a lifetime of 1 hour. and all that you need to do is follow through the clickstream, and you'll be re-authenticated and then brought back into FireCloud. You will, though, probably have to refresh the page. Okay, this is the mutation calling workspace that you cloned and you ran an analysis on. And if you see at the very bottom of this, we have a list of workspace attributes. These attributes can be referenced by the method configuration as inputs into the workflow. They are not tied to a particular entity. And typically, people go ahead and use workspace attributes to reference reference files, reference genomes, and reference indices and items like that. Okay. And we'll be able to see these in greater action. Actually, let's go ahead and take a look at the method configuration associated with this workspace. And you'll see that what we have here is what the method configuration does, and we'll get into this in greater detail shortly, but what it does is it goes ahead and for a particular workflow, you identify what the inputs and the outputs are. And what the method configuration does is to go ahead and map the workflow inputs and outputs to entity attributes within your data model. And in this particular case, we have a method configuration that is targeting a pair. That means that whenever you see this, it's saying that we're running this method configuration against a pair. The pair has an attribute called case sample in this case. Let me make this a bit larger. The entity has a pair entity has an attribute case sample, which actually points to the control sample within that pair, and that sample has an attribute BAM. So what we're saying is that the input to this particular step in the workflow is going to be obtained from the data model by taking a look at the pair that it runs against, looking at the case sample entity associated with that pair, and then looking at the BAM file associated with that sample. In these cases, we have other inputs that require, say, reference data, and those are obtained from the workspace attributes themselves. Yes?
So these might represent data that don't exist yet?
No, they will represent data that exists. And the question is whether or not the input data is associated with an entity, which it is in the case of the BAM files, or is the data a global variable, like a reference file. And in that case, it's associated with the workspace entity, with the workspace attribute.
So you have to create and populate these in a particular order because, some things don't exist yet before you start. They're outputs. So
yeah.
These outputs might be used for other things that you can't populate until you actually run this and create those outputs.
Okay.
Intermediate inputs? Or
No, these are not intermediate inputs. Yes.
So you're basically, if I understand correctly, differentiating resource data that would typically be the same for many analyses?
Yes.
The reference and the known variants and stuff like that?
Yes, exactly.
Intervals, and that's all just like background stuff of the
Yes. So
from the actual data that you want to run on today.
Right. So if you have a workflow that runs on, let's make it simpler, that runs on a sample, and you have a collection of 100 samples, you're going to go ahead and run that workflow 100 times on each sample. Each sample has its own BAM file, but that workflow may require a reference file, and that you're going to use the same reference file for each sample run. And so rather than defining an entity for all of the samples that references a reference file, instead what we do is we have attributes that are associated with the workspace, and it's from that workspace attribute that you obtain the input to that workflow for those reference files. Okay, and I think let's go a little bit further, and then I think that'll clarify what you're asking. Okay, so that's workspace attributes. Now what I want to do is to talk about tasks and workflows. An analytical pipeline or workflow is a sequence of tasks or programs that you're going to execute, and you go ahead and wire the outputs of one task to the inputs of a downstream task. In FireCloud, individual tasks are run within Docker containers. So suppose that you have a workflow that has 3 steps, like the mini mutation calling workflow. Each step is a task. Each of those tasks is going to run in a separate Docker container. And whether or not those tasks run in parallel or whether they run sequentially depends upon the plumbing or the wiring within that workflow, whether or not parallelism is possible or not. FireCloud will go ahead and run as many tasks in parallel as it can, dependent upon whether or not there are dependencies. Okay. Workflows within FireCloud are defined using the workflow description language, which defines the tasks, the inputs and outputs for each task. It also defines the wiring between the tasks within that workflow, and it also defines the workflow level inputs and outputs. When FireCloud takes a look at a workflow description in WDL, it'll break it out into a directed acyclical graph, and from that it can go ahead and determine which tasks can be immediately launched and which downstream tasks have upstream dependencies and can't run until those upstream dependencies are resolved. But each task runs on its own VM within a Docker container.
And I assume any task can fail, and you get a report saying,
Yes, yes.
You can get this out because this.
Right, yeah, it will fail. And if a task in a workflow fails, then the entire workflow fails, and it won't continue with that workflow. So within FireCloud, we use the term method to describe a workflow. And as I said, workflows are described in the workflow description language. We also have a repository that can contain WDL methods. And so if you're a tool developer, and let's go ahead and take a look at that repository right now. Okay, let's go. I'm logged in. If you go to click on Method Repository, you see that we have here a list of methods and method configurations that are available to the community. Now, as a tool developer, let's take a look at the tools that I've been working on. You can go ahead and sort of filter on them. And let's take a look at, we'll be getting into this, a Hello World tool that I went ahead and created. So each method in the method repository, you can have permissions that are associated with it. So I went ahead and uploaded this method, this WDL file, to the method repository. And because I uploaded it, I'm the owner of it. And I can go ahead and share that tool with others. So as a tool developer, you'll go ahead and upload your tools to the system. Initially, only you will be able to go ahead and run those and have access to them. If you want to go ahead and then share your tools with collaborators, then you would do is go ahead and click Add, and you would go ahead and provide the FireCloud user ID of your collaborator, and you would determine what level of access you can give them. Now, for the contents of the method repository, there are 2 levels of access. If somebody is a reader, that means they can actually run that workflow. If somebody is an owner, they can both run it and they can also update the access control list associated with that workflow.
Does a workflow contain a specification of specific inputs, or is it kind of generic so that I can point the workflow at my data, you can point the workflow at your data?
You can, what it does is and we'll go and look at this in greater detail, it specifies what the input parameters and the output parameters for the workflow are. And so those are, and then when you want to run it against a data model, you go ahead and map those inputs and outputs to attributes in your data model. And that's what the method configuration does. When we were trying to figure out what to call a method configuration, initially we were thinking of calling it a data binder because it binds the inputs and outputs of a workflow to entity attributes in the data model. Okay? For those of you who are Firehose users, you're familiar with all these concepts, I assume. Yes?
So if I see a script in the methods repository, how do I pull it into my
Workspace. We're going to show you that. Because this is it's a workshop, we have to have a hello world. And we're going to walk through the entire process of creating a tool, testing it locally, then uploading it to FireCloud, and then running it within a workspace. And so we have a method, and we're going to bring that method into a workspace to run it against data.
But if it's already in the method repository, as in I didn't write it, I just want to pull it?
You can, yeah, as long as you have read access to a method in the method repository, you can go ahead and run it in a workspace that you have writer privileges on. But we don't actually bring the method into the workspace. What we do is create a method configuration in the workspace that references that WDL file. And that's what you launch. That's why when we took a look at the mini mutation calling example, you saw that the way that we launched that workflow was starting with a method configuration in the workspace and launching that against one of the a targeted entity of the type root entity type. So that the model you should think of is there are WDL files that are in the method repository. To run a WDL within a workspace, you create a method configuration in your workspace that references that WDL file in the method repository. And when you launch, to launch the method, you'll go ahead and essentially launch that method configuration against attributes in your data model. Yes?
So the WDL files have some abstract definitions for the
Yes, and
for the files.
Yes, and we're going to be going through that.
And the method configuration binds
And the configuration.
actual Google data buckets or big data, to the GSs to the and metadata to the representations in the WDL file?
No, what the method configuration does is bind attributes within the data model. Say we have a sample and there's a BAM file. We'll go, and that BAM file, so there's, say there's a sample called sample1, that's the entity name, and there's an attribute called BAM. So what it does, what the method configuration says is that if one of the inputs for a WDL workflow is a BAM file, it's going to say that the input for that workflow is going to be obtained from the BAM attribute off of the sample entity that you're targeting. When you see this in action, it'll be clearer. Okay. We talked about method configurations. Okay, I think we already took a look at the method configuration that was used in the mini mutation calling workspace. So I won't.
Show them attributes, where the attributes are.
Yeah, we can. That's a good idea. Why don't we go ahead, because there seems to be some confusion around that. Okay, we're going to go back to the workspaces. One is fine. Okay, so these are our participants. This is what you ran it on this 100 gene participant. Let's take a look at the samples that are associated with it. So here we have, for each sample, we have these attributes. There's a BAM file, there's a BAM index, there's the foreign key that points to the participant that the sample is associated with, and there's the tissue type. Let's take a look at the method configuration. This method configuration, if we scroll down here, we see that the WDL method that it references is located in the method repository. Methods in the method repository are uniquely identified by 3 pieces of information: a namespace, the name of the workflow, in this case, mini mutation calling, and then a snapshot ID or a version. So this method configuration was created by importing that method into the into this workspace. The WDL file identifies all of these elements as inputs. And what the method configuration does is map or bind each of these workflow or task inputs to elements within the data model. So in this case, because the root entity type for this method configuration is a pair, we're looking at a pair right here, and we see that associated with the pair, or we're looking at a pair, and associated with the pair is a case sample and a control sample. Let's take a look at the samples. And associated with the sample is a BAM attribute. So what we're saying here is that this particular input parameter for the workflow is obtained by looking at the targeted pair, from that getting the case sample associated with that pair, and from that getting the value of the attribute BAM. And this means that when you go ahead and run a workflow within FireCloud, you don't explicitly identify what the input and output parameters are. Instead, what you go ahead and do is reference the inputs and outputs as attributes within the data model. So this is quite flexible because it means you can go ahead and, for example, I have a collection of 1,000 pairs, and I have a workflow that targets a pair. What I can go ahead and do is target that workflow at a pair set, and it will go ahead and iterate through all the pairs in that pair set 1,000 times and run that workflow 1,000 times, and it'll do it all in parallel. Okay? Yes?
So what if you had something that starts with a FASTQ file? Would you be using the pair for a left and a right for an RE-seq analysis, for instance, or how does
well, no. If you in that case, you would have attributes that the FASTQ files would be associated with the sample, not a pair, and you would have 2 attributes at the sample level, you know, the left reads and the right reads. And if your workflow took as inputs, made distinctions between the left reads and the out reads, those would be 2 different input values for your workflow. And you would reference them in your method configuration.
And those would just go in your attributes for your sample entity?
Yes, right. And we said that we have a data model which sort of is constrained to 6 entity types: samples, pairs, participants, and sets of all those. And yes, the data model is constrained as far as the types of entities and the relationships between the entities, but it is quite flexible in terms of the attributes. You can go ahead and attach whatever attributes that you want to your data model, and you can reference them in the method configuration. And also, you can add attributes dynamically. And that, in fact, is what happens often when you go ahead and run an analysis. In the method configuration, you go ahead and specify what these are the outputs for the workflow. And what we're saying is that we want the outputs for the workflow to be written to this attribute, contamination data, on on the pair entity. And so what this is going to do is when the workflow completes, it'll automatically create this attribute, contamination underscore dat, on your pair entity.
Does this always refer to pair?
In this case, it does because the root entity type is pair. If the root entity type was sample, this would refer to a sample entity.
And you set that when you import your method.
And you have one root type.
With each method configuration has a single root entity type.
And you can just drill down. Right?
Yes. Okay.
And if you go to the data tab and show the outputs.
I don't know if this was run. Let's see. Was it run?
Oh,
No, it wasn't run. So, okay. All right. Any questions about method configurations? Because they are really crucial. It's the bridge between the data model and the workflows within the system. And it's important to understand them. Any questions about those before I go any further? Okay, this is, before we actually start to get to the hands-on aspect of the tool developer workshop, the tool developer exercises, I just wanted to give you a quick architectural overview of the FireCloud system. It's built around a loosely coupled architecture where you have lots of microservices that each of them exposes a RESTful API, and the services communicate across one another through that RESTful API. One of the, one of the important things to note is, so this is the web interface, the Fire portal that you're looking at. This is public. The web portal is built, all of the functionality that's provided through the web portal is also provided through a RESTful API provided by this FireCloud orchestration layer. That RESTful API is public as well. So if you want to go ahead and not be constrained to use the web portal, you can go ahead and write your code directly against this orchestration layer RESTful API. You can write scripts against that. And we have online documentation for this API at api.firecloud.org. And it uses something called Swagger to document the RESTful API. We also, it isn't production ready yet, but we are implementing a command line interface built in Python that can be used for going ahead and accessing programmatically this API without explicitly writing your curl commands. A Python client library for that. Okay?
Not explicitly writing what?
Without explicitly writing curl commands to this RESTful API. Or if you're writing your script in Python, it's a package that will go ahead and make it easier to write your code against the FireCloud public API. Yes?
When you specify data, does it actually pull the data to temporary storage, block storage, and then execute analysis on there, and then?
Yes. Okay. So the question was, when you actually execute a workflow or a task in a workflow that is using data that's stored in the bucket, that task runs in a Docker container. What the system, and that Docker container is running within the Google Cloud. What it will do is take the Docker container is passed references, or when the job is launched, the input files are identified as references to the Google bucket. The system will go ahead and localize those files. It'll copy those files onto a local disk on that virtual machine. It'll then go ahead and run the tool, and when the tool is complete, it'll go ahead and delocalize or write the output files back to the bucket.
And if those are, let's say, huge BAM files, does it mean that it pulls all the data back?
Yes, it'll go ahead and pull the entire BAM file, but remember that all of this is occurring within the Google Cloud platform, and the connectivity within that platform is enormous. And so there's very little costs associated with moving these files from a bucket onto a virtual machine within the cloud, and you are not charged for it.
And what if I need to run a parallel, parallel analysis on the same data that it would pull individually?
If you're running an analysis on a virtual machine, if you have multiple virtual machines and the inputs are the same for all of those machines, you're still going to have to make local copies of it on those machines. But you don't pay for that either in terms of cost or the time required to do those file transfers, even for 50, 100 gigabit files, is not going to be terribly bad relative to the length of time it's going to take to run most of these.
Is it a 10 gigabit connection there?
Excuse me?
Is it 10 gigabit connection there internally?
I don't know what the internal connections are.
Inside Google infrastructure, and it takes seconds for them to move around in enormous files.
Yeah. Okay. And another thing that I'll point out is that FireCloud leverages a lot of the services available in the Google Cloud Platform. We go ahead and rely on Google for handling user authentication. That is why we asked people who have BroadE IDs. BroadE IDs are managed through Google, so you can go ahead and register directly with FireCloud using your BroadE ID. For those of you who are from Partners or MGH, we requested that you go ahead and register with a Gmail address. But we don't keep track of your passwords, we just go ahead and delegate the authentication to Google. This system, we rely on Google Cloud Storage for storing all the files for the buckets, and also the execution of these tasks within Docker containers. That's all managed by this Google Genomics Job Execution System, or GES. And it's this system that handles the localization of the files to go ahead and sort of pull the files from the cloud onto a virtual machine on which a task is running, and it is also taking care of the delocalization, copying files back.
So what about the users can control the software versions, like you have the repent or some other hotel or whatever you align the to? There are multiple versions available, right?
Multiple versions of a tool?
Yeah, so what is there? Can I choose which version can I use?
You can run, the tools that you run are going to be specified in the WDL file that you have. When you describe a workflow with multiple tasks, each task, there's a set of runtime parameters or parameters associated with the task. One of those parameters is a reference to the Docker image in Docker Hub for that task.
So far currently you provide the entire versions of the background process. Like you have what is the available versions, current version?
Of these tools?
Yeah.
It's, we will make the WDLs within the method repository are versioned. So there'll be different versions of those. And the steps within those WDL files are going to reference Docker images that are also versioned.
Okay. You only provide the specific versions.
We will provide specific versions, but we might go ahead and provide multiple versions. For example, if we go ahead and when we release our CGA group mutation calling workflow, we may update it at a later date, and we will maintain the original one there too. Okay. This is a overview of the tool development process within FireCloud. We are striving to make this more streamlined, building tools and web interfaces that will go ahead and sort of help with this, and command line tools that will help with this. But let's just look at the individual steps right now. So suppose you have a workflow that has 2 tasks associated with it. The first thing you need to do is go ahead and develop and test the tools. Each of those steps represents a separate tool that's run within a Docker container. You have to develop and test that tool within a Docker container, and then publish that Docker image to Docker Hub. We also support Google Container Registry, but for now we're just focusing on Docker Hub. Okay. Once you have done that, you have your kind of tools containerized, you have images for them, they are available on Docker Hub. You can then in order to run them within FireCloud, you need to go ahead and incorporate them into a WDL workflow. Within FireCloud, you cannot run just a Docker task without having it wrapped in a WDL workflow. If you have a single task and you want to test it in FireCloud, you will need to go ahead and create a single task workflow in WDL and test it that way. Now, let me just go back to this architectural picture here. So this right here is the workflow execution service. We call it Cromwell, and it is provided, the FireCloud system will go ahead and make submissions to it, identifying the inputs and identifying the WDL for the workflow you want to run. And this Cromwell workflow execution service will then go ahead and parse the WDL into a DAG, and it'll figure out which tasks can currently run, and it'll go ahead and make requests to the job execution system to run those. Now, so this Cromwell workflow execution service is part of the FireCloud loosely coupled architecture. You can also go ahead and install this or run this locally. And this is what we recommend tool developers to do. Before they go ahead and upload their WDL to the method repository and test it within the FireCloud environment, go ahead and first test it in a local installation of Cromwell to work out any WDL issues or workflow issues that you might have.
Is Cromwell a BroadE thing?
Yes.
And WDL, that language is a BroadE language?
That language is a BroadE language also. And the other, if you're familiar with the other two cloud pilots, they use a different workflow language called CWL, Common Workflow Language. We chose to use WDL because we thought it was going, as you'll see, for programmers, it's procedural, as opposed to CWL, where you define the workflow as a JSON object. And we felt that programmers would be and tool developers would be much more comfortable defining their workflows in a procedural language rather than defining it as a set of objects.
Chuck?
Yes.
Do you have plans to enable users to launch a shell within Google from within FireCloud?
Yes, we do. Yeah. Right now you cannot, and that's actually been a problem because users want to go ahead and run an analysis within FireCloud and debug it. And currently they cannot SSH into those virtual machines.
Are you talking about Google Cloud Shell? Or?
No, you'll just SSH directly into.
Because it would be also convenient to use Google Cloud Shell, because then you can pretty much do it from tablet or from anywhere.
Okay, I'm not familiar with Google Cloud Shell. Are you, Alex?
I couldn't hear all.
Yeah, could you repeat the question?
There is a Google Cloud Shell, which was in beta. I'm not sure if it's already in release, but essentially...
Yeah, it's available.
Yeah, you can just hit the button and in your browser you will have the shell right away with all the tools, with all the Google setup, you know.
Oh, so you have all the whole Google Cloud SDK installed on it, yeah. Yeah, we'll probably look into that as well, yeah. What is preventing us from doing that right now is a set of security issues.
Are you at some point going to cover how you need to specify, or maybe how one figures out what virtual machine parameters are to get created?
Yes, we have a section of the workshop on runtime parameters or attributes, and you associate those with each task, and you specify things like the number of CPUs, disk space, and things like that. Yeah, it's coming. Okay. All right, so back to this picture. I think we pretty much, well, here I was saying that once you've created your WDL, you want to go ahead and test that workflow in a local Cromwell service that you can run on your laptop or on your developed machine. Once that is done, then you're going to go ahead and publish your WDL workflow to the method repository. You're going to go ahead and create a method configuration within a workspace for that WDL, and you're going to run it against a populated data model within that workspace. So that is the process. And here this kind of identifies the path. You go ahead and build your Docker image. You develop your application in Docker container. You build the image. You go ahead and push that Docker image to Docker Hub. You go ahead and create a WDL file for it. We have a couple of tools that run locally. One is something called the WDL tool, which can validate the syntax of your WDL. Once you've done that, you can go ahead and run it against Cromwell locally. Once it runs locally on some small test data, you can then go ahead and push that WDL file to the method repository. Then what you're going to do is create a workspace, create a method, import that method into the workspace that references, and that results in the creation of a method configuration, and you're going to then go ahead and upload data, and you're going to go ahead and launch your analysis. Yes?
So the implication is that to test in the first two steps,
yes,
that you have some small data that you can test things on.
I would recommend doing that, yeah. Yeah. That's how I do tool development. Yeah. Small data that doesn't take up that much space and won't take 20 hours to run.